In 2018, I moved into a small 2-story house in England with my then boyfriend. It was nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place where houses were crammed together, all facing each other like watchful eyes. I'm an introvert by nature, not the type to engage much with neighbors. But naturally, pleasantries were exchanged. One neighbor, Greg, stood out immediately. An older gentleman, overly friendly, the type who'd trap you in a chat until you were scrambling for an excuse to escape. He shared local stories, remembered birthdays, and even invited us to a garden party, open to anyone and everyone. His house sat directly across from mine, with his windows offering a perfect, unobstructed view into my home. A couple of years passed. My boyfriend and I broke up, a quiet split I never broadcasted, but Greg must have noticed. My ex's car disappeared from the driveway, and loneliness crept in. I got a cat for company. Greg, ever watchful, flagged me down every chance he got. Annoying but harmless, or so I thought. One evening I was deep into Elder Scrolls Online, grinding a deathless speedrun. Right as my group faced the final boss, Greg knocked, 2 parcels in hand. One was huge, a table I hadn't retrieved from his place. I was too focused to pause, so I told him to leave it inside. Door unlocked. Big mistake. I heard the front door creak open, the thud of the parcel hitting the floor, then footsteps behind me. I glanced back. Greg stood there, silently watching me play. Eyes wide, lips parted, like he'd stumbled into some private fantasy. My heart raced, but the fear of letting my raid group down kept me frozen. Boss down, headset off. Amazing. Greg beamed, slurring slightly, clearly drunk. Never seen anyone use a keyboard like that. Can you teach me? I forced a laugh, brushing him off, but he wouldn't leave. It wasn't until I stood, opened the door, and stared that he finally shuffled out, disappointed. After that, little things piled up. Someone kept hauling my trash bins back in after collection. Someone was using my bins. Greg complained the same thing was happening to him, but I wasn't convinced, so I taped an old phone to my window, running a surveillance app. Guess who I caught? Greg. I chalked it up to overflowing trash. Until Christmas. Late one night, there was a knock. Greg stood there, red gift bag in hand, reeking of booze. Got you a little something? He slurred, pushing it toward me. Wish I could give you a Christmas kiss, but you know, pandemic and all. My skin crawled. I muttered thanks, trying to close the door, but he rambled on until I firmly told him I was busy. That's when it happened. He grabbed my shoulder, leaned in, and kissed my cheek. I slammed the door and stood there, heart pounding. Inside the gift bag, 2 dusty Belgian beers, half-eaten sour cream and onion Pringles, and a plastic bag of chocolates. I recognized them. My neighbor's kids had passed them out weeks prior. Greg hadn't even removed the handwritten note. That night I decided, no more polite smiles, no more ignoring the red flags. The new year brought fresh dread. I ordered food. 5 minutes after delivery, Greg knocked. Saw your delivery. Everything okay? It clicked. He was watching my house. Always. He knocked again that night. And the next. I ignored him, heart racing, curtains drawn. Eventually I called the police, not to press charges, just to get it on record. But when Greg showed up days later, eyes glassy with hurt, saying, "I just wanted to be your friend," I knew it was time to shut him out completely. A year passed in peace until winter. One dark evening, heading for groceries, I locked my door and froze. A figure slipped out of my driveway, disappearing behind the tall panel fence. I told myself it was nothing, but my gut screamed otherwise. I retreated inside, groceries forgotten, and bought a motion sensor light the next day. Weeks later, while feeding my cat, the light flickered on. I glanced outside. Nothing. But then, in the bottom corner of the window, a shadow crouched low. My breath hitched. I squinted, heart thudding. until Greg popped up, face pressed against the glass, eyes wild. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed. He blinked, calm as ever. "Are you all right?" I didn't stop screaming until he backed into the darkness. Shaking, I called the police. This time, they acted fast. Greg was arrested in front of a wife I never knew existed. The officer told me he had a history of following young women. He got off with a caution, banned from my side of the cul-de-sac, but it was enough. I moved soon after. If you'd been in my shoes, when would you have called the police? After the kiss, the bins, or when he first walked into my house, uninvited? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious how long it takes for friendly to become frightening. Moving into a new home is supposed to be a fresh start, a dream come true. But sometimes, dreams rot from the inside, and you don't realize you're living in a nightmare until it's too late. My wife and I moved into what we thought was our dream house. A quiet street, friendly neighbors, and enough space to start a family. Everything was perfect. Well, almost everything. The first time we met Mrs. Hathaway, she seemed harmless. An elderly woman next door, overly chatty but sweet. She showed up the day we moved in, holding a steaming casserole dish and an unnerving smile. "I've lived here for 30 years, she chirped. "Seen families come and go. I always welcome the new folks. If you ever need anything at all, just let me know." We thanked her, shared polite smiles, and thought nothing of it. But kindness can be a mask, and sometimes it's hiding something rotten. At first, her presence was endearing, waving from her porch, offering unsolicited advice on everything from lawn care to window treatments. But soon, it became invasive. Every time we stepped outside to check the mail, water the plants, take out the trash, there she was, watching, smiling, like she always knew our schedule, our routines. One night around 10 p.m., there was a knock at the door. My wife and I exchanged a confused glance. We were halfway through a movie. Who knocks that late? I opened the door. There stood Mrs. Hathaway, holding a basket of muffins. "Thought you might like a late-night snack," she said. Her smile stretched too wide. I forced a smile, thanked her, and closed the door. But the uneasy feeling stayed. "Okay, real quick, what would you do in this situation? Brush it off as quirky neighbor behavior? Or confront her? Drop your answer in the comments because what happens next will change everything." The next weekend, while my wife and I were gardening, I noticed her standing on her porch, not moving, just staring, for hours. But the final straw? Coming home one evening and finding her inside our backyard, not knocking, not calling out, just standing there, running her fingers along the rose bushes. "Mrs. Hathaway," I snapped, marching toward her. "What are you doing?" Her head tilted, that smile never fading. "Just checking on the garden, dear. You needed help with the roses, didn't you?" That night we decided boundaries. Clear, firm, no exceptions. But boundaries mean nothing when someone has already crossed every line. A few days later, my wife found it. A tiny, old-fashioned camera hidden behind the books on our living room shelf. My heart sank. We searched the house and found 2 more. One in the kitchen, another in the hallway. Mrs. Hathaway had been inside our house, watching, recording. Furious, I stormed to her door, cameras in hand. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. Her expression didn't change. If anything, her smile widened. "I was just looking out for you, dear, making sure you were safe." Safe? Safe from what? From her. We called the police. But there was no proof she'd planted the cameras. No fingerprints, nothing. Just our word against hers. After that, she stopped visiting. No more muffins, no more gardening tips. But every time we looked outside, we'd see her shadow through the curtains, watching, always watching. Then one night, my wife woke up screaming. She swore she'd seen someone standing in our bedroom doorway. But when I jumped up, there was no one there. That was it. The next morning, we packed our bags and left. Sold the house, never looked back. To this day, I don't know what Mrs. Hathaway truly wanted. Control, obsession, or something far worse. But one thing still haunts me. A few weeks after we moved, I got a letter. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid. It was a picture of my wife and me, sleeping in our bed. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and this happened over a year and a half. Starting in November of 2011, I was living alone in a small 2-bedroom house at the end of a quiet street, right next to an open field. The area wasn't the safest, not quite the ghetto, but definitely the kind of place where you double-check your locks at night. I've always enjoyed my solitude. No family nearby, no close friends in town. My life was simple. Wake up at 5:40 a.m. for a jog. Work by 6:30, lunch break at 11, home by 4, class at 5:30, and another jog at 7:30 p.m. like clockwork. Predictable, yes, but safe, or so I thought. That predictability is probably why my neighbor, A.J., took notice. He lived 4 houses down, and at first seemed harmless. Just a man standing on his lawn, watching the world go by. But then I realized he wasn't just watching the world. He was watching me. Every morning jog, every walk home, he'd be there, silent, arms crossed, eyes following me until I closed my door. After a while, the silence broke. "Hey, how are you?" he'd call out. I'd nod, mumble a quick, "Good, thanks," and keep walking. But friendly greetings quickly turned into invasive questions. "You live alone, right? Where do you work? Why don't you ever have visitors?" I kept my answers vague. "I'm busy, work in town. I like my privacy." But my evasion didn't stop him. If anything, it made him more determined. One day I caught him rifling through my mail. He didn't even look embarrassed, just replaced the envelopes and strolled off like it was normal. The final straw came after my best friend visited for my birthday. The next morning, AJ was waiting. "Who was that guy? Your boyfriend?" "He stayed for hours. What were you doing?" My polite facade cracked. "That's none of your business," I snapped, speeding up my jog. But AJ wasn't done. One evening, as I was returning from my usual run, he came charging out of his house, face twisted in anger. He blocked my path, arms crossed like a bouncer. "We need to talk, now." I froze. He was big, huskier, taller, and his tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "About what?" I managed. His face softened into something almost pitying. "Every day you're out here, alone. I know everything about you. This is my neighborhood. I see everything. You have no friends, no family. You're lonely. I can save you. I love you. Love me." My skin crawled. I backed away, heart racing. "First of all," I snapped, "you don't know me. You've never known me, and I don't need saving. Leave me the hell alone." And then he laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, a deep, belly-aching giggle, like I'd just told the funniest joke in the world. When he finally caught his breath, his smile vanished. "I do know you. I know you better than you know yourself, and I hate how you're always running. You don't need exercise. You need to come to my house, have some beers, relax, stop being so serious." I didn't wait for him to finish. I bolted, slammed my door shut, and called a friend who begged me to contact the cops. But I didn't. Maybe it was denial. Maybe I thought ignoring him would make it stop. It didn't. From then on, I changed my routine. I avoided the main road, cutting through the open field instead. I joined a gym to avoid jogging near the house. If I saw AJ outside, I stayed indoors until he disappeared. But paranoia only works if you're perfect. And one rainy afternoon, I slipped up. He saw me crossing the field. He sprinted, full speed. "Wait!" he yelled, feet splashing through puddles. I ran like hell. I barely made it inside, locking the door behind me. Seconds later, he was banging on it, yelling my name. My full name, which he'd clearly gotten from my mail. The banging stopped, and when I finally peeked out the window, he was gone. But on the doormat was a folded note. I picked it up, hands trembling. It read, "Call me, AJXOXO. Here's where I need your opinion. What would you have done in my shoes? Called the cops? Moved out immediately? Confronted him? Let me know in the comments. Because to this day, I'm not sure if I made the right choice. I didn't call the police. My lease was almost up, and I figured I could tough it out for another week. I avoided AJ like the plague, packed in silence and counted down the days. Moving day finally came. With friends and co-workers helping, we loaded the last of my things into the cars. I glanced down the street hoping, praying, AJ would stay inside. He didn't. As we pulled away, he stormed into the road, waving his arms. "Why didn't you tell me you were moving? You're supposed to tell me everything." One of my friends rolled down the window just enough to yell back. "I thought you knew everything, bud." We laughed. AJ didn't. That was the last time I ever saw him. But even now, in a new town, a safer place, I can't help but wonder, was I really ever safe, or did I just get lucky? Moving into my new place had me excited. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. A small house with a backyard, just within my budget. It felt like progress. I spent the first few weeks unpacking, decorating, and settling into a routine. Work, come home, relax, repeat. Simple, peaceful. Or so I thought. It didn't take long before I noticed him, my neighbor. An older man, living directly across the street. At first it seemed harmless. He was always outside, sitting on his porch, standing in his yard. Maybe retired, maybe just enjoying the weather. But then I realized something strange. No matter when I came home, early morning, late at night, or even on weekends, he was always there, watching. His eyes never drifted, never blinked, just locked onto my house. It wasn't the casual glance of a bored neighbor. It felt deliberate, intense. He never waved, never smiled, just watched. At first I tried to shrug it off. People can be weird, right? Maybe he was lonely, unaware of how unsettling it felt. But the more I saw him, the more his constant presence gnawed at me. One evening I came home from work, exhausted, and there he was, as always, sitting on his porch, sipping coffee. Only this time, he wasn't just sitting. He was standing. My heart skipped. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, eyes locked on me. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. But the feeling of being watched, it lingered. If this were you, if a neighbor watched your every move, never speaking, never acknowledging, would you confront them or just ignore it and hope they'd stop? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm curious what you'd do, because what happened next? Ignoring wasn't an option. It started small. The garden hose moved from where I'd left it. Footprints in the dirt near my side window. The back gate left open, even though I always closed it. Then one night, past midnight, I woke up to the soft crunch of gravel outside my bedroom window. Footsteps. I froze, listened. There it was again, slow, deliberate. Someone walking alongside the house. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and peeked through the curtain. At first I saw nothing. The yard, empty. The street, quiet. But then I spotted him, standing dead center in my yard, 10 feet from my window, just standing there. I stumbled back, knocking over a lamp, my breath caught in my throat. I called the police, barely able to speak. My neighbor, he's in my yard. He's watching me. The dispatcher assured me officers were on the way, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. The police left, unconvinced, but I knew what I saw. From that night on, I double-locked every door, checked every window, left lights on in every room. But it didn't matter. He always found a way. One evening I came home late, exhausted, on edge. His porch light was on, but he wasn't there. Relief washed over me. Maybe tonight I'd finally sleep, but as I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. There on the table where I always left my keys was a note. A crumpled, stained piece of paper, folded neatly. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left anything there. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. 3 words, scrawled in shaky, almost childlike handwriting. I see you. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. How had he gotten inside? How long had he been here? There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing. Just that note. I called the police again, my voice barely more than a whisper. But when they arrived, same story. No fingerprints, no forced entry, no evidence. Like he'd never been there at all. That night I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay another moment. Not with the constant feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I never saw my neighbor again. But his eyes, his cold, blank stare, it haunts me to this day. Now let me ask you, if you found that note in your house with no trace of how it got there, would you stay or would you run? Tell me in the comments, because the scariest part, sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones standing right in front of you. If this story left you unsettled, hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Got your own terrifying neighbor story? Drop it below. I'd love to hear it. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, some eyes never blink. When I first moved into my new house, it felt like a fresher start. After years of renting cramped apartments, I finally had a place to call my own. A cozy little house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. And that feeling, that pride, it's hard to describe. The street was perfect. Old trees lined the sidewalks, and most houses were home to families or older couples who'd lived there for decades. Kids played in their yards. Neighbors waved from porches. It was the kind of place where you'd expect nothing bad to ever happen. The house next door was vacant when I moved in. But that changed about 2 weeks later. A moving truck rumbled up the driveway. A man, early 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and cold, hard eyes, stepped out. He looked like someone who'd spent years working with his hands, weathered and worn. But there was something else, something in the way he carried himself, something that made my skin crawl. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared at me through the window, expressionless, before heading inside. I brushed it off. People move in and out all the time, right? But that stare, it stayed with me. The first real interaction came a week later. I was trimming the bushes along the fence when I noticed him standing on his porch, watching me, arms crossed, unmoving, eyes fixed on every move I made. "Hey," I called out, forcing a smile. "How's it going?" He didn't answer, just stared, like he was deciding something. Finally, he spoke. "You live alone? Weird question, right?" I hesitated. Yeah, just me." He nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. "That's good," he muttered. "Easier that way?" Hold on, what do you think he meant by that? Easier that way. Easier for what? Let me know what you think in the comments. I tried to laugh it off, went back to trimming the bushes, but the rest of the day, I could feel his eyes on me, even after he went inside. Then things got darker. At night, I'd hear footsteps pacing up and down his driveway, low muttering like he was arguing with someone. Only there was no one there. One morning I found my mailbox smashed in. Coincidence? Maybe. But my gut told me otherwise. It escalated fast. He'd leave random junk in my yard, broken tools, empty bottles, like warnings. Sometimes I'd catch him standing by the fence at 3 a.m., just staring at my house. But the worst, the absolute worst, was the pounding on my front door. Middle of the night, relentless, like someone trying to break the door down. I froze, heart racing, grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering, "There's someone at my door." He's trying to get in. By the time the cops arrived, nothing. John, that was his name, was back in his house, lights off, like nothing happened. They couldn't do much without proof. Then one afternoon, the final straw. I looked out the window, and there he was, standing by my fence, a brick in his hand. My car window, completely smashed. I snapped, stormed outside, phone in hand, dialing the police as I walked. "What the hell is your problem?" I shouted. He just grinned, that twisted, malicious grin. "You think the cops can stop me?" He sneered. "I've been through worse, and I always come out on top." That's when it hit me. He wasn't just angry. He was dangerous, unhinged. The police came, arrested him for property damage. But I knew this wasn't over. I put the house up for sale the next day. It took months, but I finally moved out. Even now, in my new home, I can't relax. I don't trust my neighbors, not anymore. Because the scariest part, I never found out what easier that way really meant, and I'm not sure I want to. Have you ever had that gut feeling? The one that tells you something is wrong, even when everything looks perfectly fine? I ignored mine, and I almost paid the price. I had lived in my house for about a year before things started to feel off. Nothing dramatic at first, just little things. I'd come home from work and find the blinds in the living room slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed them before leaving. Sometimes the kitchen light would be on, even though I distinctly remembered turning it off that morning. I chalked it up to forgetfulness, long hours, living alone. It was easy to overlook small details, but as days passed, the little things piled up. Then one evening I came home after a late shift and froze. The front door was slightly ajar, not wide open, just enough to send a chill down my spine. I stood on the porch, heart pounding. My neighborhood was quiet and safe, the kind where people barely locked their doors. But this wasn't right. I pushed the door open slowly. The house was quiet, untouched, yet something felt wrong. I checked the windows, the back door, the locks, all secure. Maybe I forgot. I whispered to myself. I had to believe that. But a few days later, it happened again. This time, I knew I had locked the door. I remembered standing there, keys in hand, twisting the deadbolt. Yet when I got home, it was unlocked. My stomach dropped. I stepped inside, heart racing, senses on high alert. Everything seemed normal until I walked into the kitchen. The silverware drawer was open, not wide, just slightly, like someone had been searching quietly, carefully. I froze. I never left it like that. I backed away. My breath caught in my throat. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Call the police? Confront someone? Or pretend nothing happened? Comment below. I'm curious what your gut would tell you. From that point on, paranoia consumed me. I double-checked locks, sealed windows, and placed small objects strategically so I'd know if someone entered. And then I started suspecting my neighbor, Frank. Frank lived next door, friendly, chatty, too observant. He'd casually mention things he shouldn't know. "Late night at work again? You left around 7 this morning, right?" His words stuck with me. One night I came home to find my bedroom light on. I never left it on. My pulse quickened as I crept inside. Everything seemed untouched, except for my nightstand. There sat a keychain, a tiny flashlight attached. It wasn't mine. My skin crawled. Had Frank been inside? The thought made me sick. Fueled by fear and anger, I bought security cameras the next day. If someone was sneaking in, I'd catch them. I installed cameras around the house, checked the feed obsessively, and waited. For a week, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Then at 2:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I grabbed the phone, my breath shallow as I opened the app. The side yard, shadows shifting. And there he was, Frank, He was crouched by the side window, fiddling with the latch. My stomach twisted. I watched, horrified, as he quietly slid the window open, practiced, precise, like he'd done it many times before. I didn't hesitate. I called 911, my voice shaking as I described the scene unfolding live. As I spoke, Frank slipped inside. I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed and crept down the hallway. My home, my safe space, invaded. I heard him in the kitchen, rummaging through drawers. Without thinking, I swung the bat. The sickening thud echoed, and Frank crumpled, groaning in pain. The sirens wailed in the distance. Within minutes, the police arrived, yanking Frank to his feet and slapping on handcuffs. He didn't speak, just glared at me, eyes cold and calculating. The footage confirmed everything. Frank had been sneaking into my house for weeks, maybe longer. He was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering. But you know what's worse? Even after Frank was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed the locks, added more cameras, even installed a security system. My home no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap. I moved out a few months later, into a small apartment in the city, where I could vanish into the crowd. But even now, I still check the locks 3 times before leaving. I still scan the security cameras every night before bed. Because once you realize someone's been living in your home, without you knowing, you never feel safe again. Growing up in the bottom was sometimes difficult. Every year the flood came, and when it did, it severely limited my roaming area. Unless the flood reached our yard, a rare occurrence. Most of the kids from the bottom would gather in our yard to play football or baseball. Altogether, there were usually 8 or 10 of us, kids from the bottom and a few other neighbors. We'd pick teams and play whatever game was popular at the moment. When we moved away in November of 1984, it was a sad time for me. I was 15, leaving behind the only friends I'd ever known, some of whom I'd known since kindergarten. We moved for several reasons. My father got a better job offer in another state. My mother had attended college for cake decorating and wanted to start her business in a bigger town. Our trailer house was also showing its age. But the most important reason was that the population of Kniffik, and especially the bottom, had really grown. And not in a good way. The bottom had become a magnet for people who weren't exactly on the best terms with the law. Police visits became more frequent, and it wasn't unusual to see blue and red lights flashing past our house or hear sirens in the middle of the night. One night, a helicopter landed in the field across from our house, met by an ambulance minutes later. We heard someone had broken into a house in the bottom and had been shot. It just wasn't the tight-knit community it used to be. Strange cars and unfamiliar faces became the norm. The summer of 1984 was eventful for me on several levels. I turned 14 in July and got my first razor among other gifts. My voice had finally stopped squeaking, and I grew to about 5 feet 10 inches. I played cornerback on the high school football team, and Dad was teaching me to work on cars by fixing up an old '73 Cougar for when I got my license. Most importantly, I was in love with a girl down the street, Heather. She consumed my every thought, wish, and desire. Heather and I had known each other since her family moved in a year after us. We'd ridden the bus together for almost 9 years. She was my first crush, first kiss, first love, my first everything. Heather was a year younger than me. We went from hating each other in elementary school to tolerating each other in junior high. When I started high school, she was still in junior high, so we went to different schools. I can still remember the exact moment I saw her differently, as more than the skinny black-haired girl from down the street. It was after Christmas break, She got on the bus wearing new glasses. Weird, I know, but those glasses magnified the prettiest green eyes I'd ever seen. She caught me staring and smiled, braces and all. By the time she started high school the following year, we were inseparable. Our mothers were good friends. Her mom often teased us, saying things like, "You two will have the cutest kids," or, "I hear wedding bells." It embarrassed the hell out of me every time. Her dad, on the other hand, would just give me a stern look and say, "Be nice." I always was, for the most part. Heather had diabetes, which amazed me. She had to get shots every single day, but she just shrugged it off as part of life. One summer, she broke her ankle jumping off a spooked horse. Every afternoon, I'd ride the bus past my house to hers, carry her books inside, and walk home. Her mom always invited me to stay for dinner, but I never did. About a week after Heather broke her ankle, we came home from school one day and saw a new trailer house in the lot next to hers. Her mom said she'd already met the family. A mom, a boy my age, and his younger brother, about 8 or 9. I met them a few days later when they started riding the school bus. Robert, the older one, was actually just a year younger than Heather. He was tall, gangly, and clumsy, with thick glasses. He was quiet, kept to himself, and was deep into Dungeons and Dragons. We invited him to play football and other stuff, but he was never interested. He read a lot and stayed indoors. Heather had already told me he watched her whenever she was outside, but whenever she waved, he'd pretend not to see. His younger brother, Jason, was different. His head was too big for his body, and his teeth and ears were too big for his head. He was mouthy, always claiming he or someone he knew had done everything better. It got so bad that we'd make up things just to see if he'd take the bait. And he always did. Oh yeah, I know all about the Chevrolet Z56, a 12-cylinder, 6-wheel car coming out next year. He'd brag. Or, my uncle's got one of those new army bullets that can shoot around corners and go through tanks. Jason was also a klepto. Pencils, rulers, Hot Wheels, baseball cards, ball caps. Anything not nailed down was fair game. If you caught him, he'd insist his aunt or teacher gave it to him. His mother and Robert always backed him up. Jason was the ultimate instigator. He'd tell one kid that another was talking about him just to watch the reaction. In games, if things didn't go his way, he'd demand a do-over. If we refused, we were liars and cheaters. It didn't take long for Jason to wear out his welcome. One day, Heather caught him behind their well house, hunched over something. When he didn't hear her approach, she got closer and screamed. He was pulling the feathers and skin off a dead bird. When she asked, horrified, what he was doing, Jason just grinned and said, "I want the skull." About a month later, Heather's father caught Jason in their well house, stuffing wrenches into his pockets. He grabbed Jason by the arm and marched him home, demanding he confess to his mother. But when Jason's mom saw her baby being manhandled, she exploded, threatening to sue. Heather's dad just muttered, "That kid's damned creepy." A week or so later, Robert showed up at my house asking if I'd seen Jason. He was supposed to be home for dinner, and it was almost dark. My mom overheard and mentioned she'd seen Jason playing with a dog near the old abandoned barn across the road about an hour earlier. Jason and Robert missed school for the next few days. When Robert finally got back on the bus, he told me everything. He'd found Jason in the barn, covered in blood, skinning the dog. It was like he'd been playing in it. Robert whispered, pale. He'd run home and told his dad, who dragged Jason out of the barn. That's when they saw the shelf. Skulls, dozens of them, bird skulls, mouse skulls, and bigger ones, probably 15 or 20, black and brown, some with skin still clinging to them. Flies buzzed everywhere. The stench was unbearable. After school that afternoon, I couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself. but someone had already cleared everything out. The barn reeked, and sawdust covered the dirt floor. Robert said his parents had a huge fight that night. His dad wanted to get Jason help. His mom insisted he was just a curious little boy. Jason didn't ride the bus for another 3 or 4 weeks. When he finally came back, he was hollow. He didn't speak. He didn't react. Just stared out the window, mouth slightly open. In hindsight, he must have been medicated. Attempts to get his attention turned into ear flicks and head swats. Nothing. Robert eventually made everyone leave him alone. Then, one rainy afternoon, as we neared home, Jason started hitting himself. No one noticed at first, until Bobby turned around and shouted, "Hey, Robert, your brother's hitting himself in the face. He's bleeding all over." Robert ran up the aisle, panic written all over his face.